Loving God, we gather today to praise you, who are always at work in our lives. In the ordinary moments of our days and in the work of our hands, you reveal your presence and love. We ask that you bless our time together. May all that we do magnify your love for others. And may our lives bear witness to your goodness, mercy, and compassion. May the love of God transform our lives with grace. We pray to the Lord.
With the angel's words, we greet Mary. Hail, full of grace. In her, we see what it means to be wholly receptive to your love. To trust the promise that nothing is impossible with God. Her quiet consent echoes through history. Let it be done to me according to your word. You remind us, O God, that where grace is welcomed, love takes flesh.
Well, a very good evening and welcome to the 2026 Marian Lecture. My name is John Robinson, and if you're expecting Geraldine Doog as your host, you're sorely disappointed. Geraldine is a late apology for this event, and on behalf of the Marist Association of St Marcellin, Champagnat, and Marist Schools Australia, extend to each of you, both here and online, a very, very warm welcome to this year's lecture. This year we are fortunate to welcome Reverend Dr. Sarah Bachelard to deliver the Marian Lecture. A Rhodes Scholar, Sarah pursued theological studies at Oxford, where she was tutored by none other than Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Sarah is the founder and spiritual director of Benedictus Contemplative Church, an ecumenical community integrating contemplation into weekly worship. A theologian and leader in contemplative practice, Sarah has taught at Charles Sturt University, was an honorary research fellow at the Australian Catholic University, and is the author of several books, including her most recent book, Pools of Grace. In this book, Sarah references the opening lines of the Rule of St Benedict, inviting us to incline the ear of our heart. It is this posture we would encourage you to adopt both here in Sydney and online, as we listen to Sarah reflect on the Marist Association's theme, Full of Grace, inviting us to dare to imagine a life shaped by grace. Tonight you're most welcome to ask questions following her keynote address, and for those online, please submit your questions via the link provided in the chat box at any time during the presentation. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Bachelard.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the invitation to the Marist Association to give this lecture, which is a great honour for me. Thank you for being here in the room tonight and for those of you online. Well, 25 years ago, I was a mess. I just finished a PhD, not at Oxford, I have to say. I just finished a PhD, but it was a difficult and desolating experience. My confidence was through the floor. I was chronically anxious. I felt as though I were teetering on the edge of an abyss. I'd had all kinds of ambitions to make a difference, to contribute something special. But now all hope of this had drained away. I had peers who seemed to be moving onwards and ever upwards. I felt like a failure, a fraud, like that cliche of a Rhodes Scholar, someone with a great future behind them. It was as if life was over and all I could hope for was to survive the next 60 or so years. One weekend I was in Sydney doing a course for personal transformation, still trying to get myself back on track. There was a break between sessions. I went to sit on my own down by Darling Harbour, my despair close to the surface. I was watching the water, gazing at the life going on around me, people coming and going, all the while wrestling with fear and a profound sense of inadequacy. I knew it was perfectly okay for all these other people to live ordinary lives, have ordinary joys and pleasures, but somehow I felt I'm not allowed that. I have to do more than that, be more than that. And then suddenly it clicked. That's a lie. I'm the only one telling that story. I'm the one saying I've got to be more than everyone else just to be okay. But it's not true. I can just let myself be here with everyone else. The relief of that moment was indescribable. Colours were brighter. The world was beautiful. I found myself exclaiming internally again and again, I'm inadequate. I'm inadequate. Isn't that fantastic? At last, there was nowhere else I had to get, nothing else I had to accomplish. I could relax and be simply human, a human being among others, no better and no worse. Well, at this point in my life, I'd been out of the church for about 10 years. The experience itself came with no overt religious trappings. But it was an experience of grace. And it's what led me back to faith. Because what followed almost immediately from this profound experience of letting myself be was a profound love for other people. I saw how almost all of us are trapped in some desperate effort to justify our existence, to make good, to earn love and our place in the world. I was working in those days as a researcher in the Senate Committee Office of the Australian Parliament, and soon afterwards found myself in a committee meeting overwhelmed with tenderness and compassion for a rather obnoxious senator from Western Australia. It was as if I could see right through his pomposity and vanity to an insecure boy in need of love. I wasn't trying hard to love my neighbour or love others as myself. Love was just there. Underneath everything, once my own anxious striving had been let go, I found myself immersed in love. And for me, that opened the possibility of returning to the church. I saw that for all its faults and failings, for all that it betrays this truth, the church exists in our world as a public institution to say, this is what it's about. This love is the ground of everything. It's for everyone. And that struck me as extraordinary. I didn't know if I believed in the creed or in Jesus, but I knew the love bit was true. Of course, after a few days, the experience began to fade in intensity. People started to annoy me again. My own anxieties and ambitions to be special hadn't all magically disappeared. Even so, something had fundamentally shifted. I couldn't doubt the truth of what I'd felt and seen. And so began a long, slow process of learning to live into grace, a process of realising it more fully. There's a kind of paradox about grace. On the one hand, it's everywhere. The whole world is gift, charged with the grandeur of God, as Gerard Manley Hopkins puts it. This grandeur, this grace, this beauty shines out like shining from shook foil. Sometimes we glimpse it in the movement of light through leaves, or in the sun rising on a restless surf, in the still quietness of a city park, or in the life of another creature going about the mysterious creaturely business of being a bird, a wombat, a cat. Sometimes we glimpse it in other people, in the caress of a lover, the birth of a child, the smile of a friend, the encouragement of a teacher, or the unexpected kindness of a bus driver, Centrelink worker, a carer. Grace is everywhere and always available for receiving, for sharing. And yet, as another poet, Denise Levertov, puts it,
End it.
Days pass when I forget the mystery, when I fail to notice. Maybe I'm preoccupied or stressed. Problems insoluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention, says Levertov. And along with a host of diversions, they crowd out my awareness of grace. Perhaps grief or trauma have dulled my capacity to receive. Perhaps I'm blocked by chronic pain, by shame or guilt. Sometimes I'm almost frightened to allow the gift, suspicious, hardly daring to trust it could be for me, for us. Although grace is everywhere and always available, often we're not feeling it. There may be glimpses, but we don't reliably inhabit its realm. The glimpse fades, the so-called real world comes crashing back in, and we're cast out of the kingdom again. Thomas Merton said, "We already have everything, but we don't know it, and we don't experience it." And yet he insists everything has been given to us in Christ. All we need is to experience what we already possess. Yeah? Well, how do we do that? Iris Murdoch, novelist and philosopher, saw that grace breaks through in moments when our habitual self-preoccupation lifts and we're properly present to the reality of the people and the world around us, present to the mystery and wonder of life itself. I think that's what happened for me that time in Darling Harbour. And I imagine we've all known such moments. But if we want our awareness of grace to be more than momentary, if we want grace to become the atmosphere we breathe, the reality which shapes our whole lives, then that lifting of self-preoccupation must somehow be sustained over time. It must go deeper. Murdoch speaks of unselfing. Our tradition speaks of leaving self behind, dying to self, becoming, as Jesus said, poor in spirit. I know this language is easily misunderstood. All too often in the Christian tradition, the notion of dying to self has been interpreted moralistically and violently, as if God wants us to kill ourselves off, think systematically less of ourselves, or dampen the spark. But this is a distortion of the essential teaching. Dying to self isn't about self-punishment, but self-forgetting. It's about being liberated from self-obsession, self-centeredness, and the illusion that our value is defined by what we make of our lives, so that we must earn our reward, justify our existence, possess our own righteousness. Leaving self behind is about giving up our attempts to control our own meaning and image. It's daring to receive and savour our life from God's hand as gift. But how does this become possible? How do we truly leave ourselves behind? Let go our projects of self-making and come to a point of radical availability, radical receptivity. I'm going to suggest there are two primary routes. One goes by way of failure, loss, suffering. Getting to the end of your own resources, usually kicking and screaming, and realising you just can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps anymore. Perhaps a life project fails, a relationship ends, a loved one dies, a dream or sense of future collapses. Some event may force me to confront my own shadow, the parts of myself I like to keep hidden, even from myself. Or I may have to recognise the impact of my way of being on others, my complicity in injustice or wrongdoing. You think of the crisis suffered by St. Paul, thinking himself blameless and on his way to another lynching, suddenly brought to see himself in a new light, realising that his righteous zeal had turned him into a murderer. One route to poverty of spirit is the collapse of our self-image, our aspirations to self-righteousness and self-sufficiency. A second route to poverty of spirit is prayer. Particularly, I think, the practice of silent, self-emptying, contemplative prayer. When I first started practicing this way of prayer in meditation, I sometimes experienced a sense almost of vertigo. Not a physical sensation so much as a psychological one. During the time of silent meditation, we seek, as best we can, to let go all our thoughts and give our whole attention to the repeated prayer word, the mantra, or the breath, and to be wholly present. This means giving up the familiar round of worries and plans, the inner commentary that somehow constitutes my sense of myself and my grip on my experience. Letting all this go during the time of meditation can be deeply unnerving, because when this constant background hum of my opinions, impressions and anxieties goes quiet, who am I? What will become of me in this empty space? Father John Main, the Benedictine monk, whose teaching is at the foundation of the World Community for Christian Meditation, wrote of the totality of the commitment involved in this self-surrendering prayer, by means of which we gradually leave ourselves behind. There comes a delicate moment in our progress, he says, when we see the total poverty involved in the mantra. So, crisis and contemplation, two routes to unselfing, to letting go that habitual self-preoccupation. If we seek to know more than momentary glimpses of the grace in which all things are held, if we seek to imagine living our whole lives shaped by grace, then our first task is to keep returning to this place of poverty and radical receptivity. Grace, by definition, is never a possession. It's always given and being given, which means we must be constantly turning and returning to the giver, open and undefended. And this seems close to the essential charism of Marist spirituality, since Mary is one of our clearest icons of this open, undefended receptivity bearing the fruit of grace. And as Mary also shows, this constant turning and returning is the journey of a lifetime, an endless growth in love. I'm just going to have a little pause here. Just invite you to take a moment, perhaps to, as Mary did, ponder these things. Perhaps to become present to moments in your own life where you feel that you've encountered grace, and perhaps connections to moments of times of crisis or contemplation. And we wonder, how do we become more open, like Mary, to receiving this gift of grace? What happens then as we find ourselves on this way? What is the shape of a life committedly open to grace? What does it offer for the life of the world? In the biblical imagination, I think we can discern three key dimensions or aspects of grace-filled, grace-shaped lives. See if these resonate for you, and we can come back to them in the discussion afterwards. But what I'm going to suggest is that a grace-shaped life, or a life shaped by grace, will be expectant, will be merciful, and it will be true. I'm going to say a little about each of these aspects. So, expectant. A couple of years after grace had touched me that day at Darling Harbour, I found myself again in a tough time. I was in my late 30s, single and childless, with every prospect of remaining so. I was still working for Senate committees, but though it was good and interesting work, it wasn't vocational for me. I hadn't found what was really mine to do. I was well aware how privileged I was and how much was good in my life. And yet I was deeply unsatisfied and unhappy. I wanted a loving relationship. I wanted to find my real purpose in life. I wanted a context to give what I had to give. I tried very hard to shake things up, to make things happen, but nothing had shifted. And once again, I felt myself close to despair and at the end of my own resource. One morning, in another of those moments, I woke with the words of Mary in my head. Let it be with me according to your word. I realised that, once again, I'd been rushing around, trying to force an outcome, trying to make my life happen. But it was all self-generated demandingness. I want this, I want that, I want it now. I hadn't been listening at all. Parker Palmer, the American Quaker and educationalist, wrote, "Before you tell your life what you intend to do with it, listen for what your life intends to do with you." And that was the day I committed to the twice daily practice of meditation, a practice of deep listening and receptivity. It was the day I began learning to trust that something would come if only I held open the space. The scriptures are full of God doing new things in places that seemed hopelessly unpromising. Springs in the desert, a people called forth from slavery, children born of barren mothers, the resurrection of the dead. Pope Francis said, "God is capable of changing everything gratuitously." God calls the unlikeliest people to share in the work of the world's renewal. Prophets with speech impediments, apostles with histories of running away or persecuting the church. Story after story testifies to God doing a new thing, the grace of God breaking open the closed, determined, miserly spaces we tend to create for ourselves and each other. Being shaped by grace means learning to trust this gratuity, learning to wait expectantly on the creating and recreating life of God. And yet, this expectancy, this looking to grace, is a subtle matter. It's not the fixed expectation that things will turn out just the way I think they should, or that all my prayers will be answered. It's not believing in a God who will intervene against the grain of the natural order or override the integrity of human lives, as if God forces or manipulates the world to conform to God's so-called preordained purposes. No, the grace of God works in and through the life of the world, in and through us. The grace of God is the energy of possibility which calls all things to be and continues to call creation to realise its own fullness. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, has a beautiful way of expressing this. He speaks of the act of God working outward from the heart of being. So to say, as Pope Francis did, that God is capable of changing everything gratuitously isn't to be glibly assured that God will beam in from the outside to fix all our problems or save us from disaster. Rather, it expresses faith in the possibility that God's grace may well up for life's healing and renewal even in the darkest times, if only we dare hold open the space. And that holding open might be the work of a long time. It involves seeking to discern and respond to the promptings of grace arising in our midst. And who knows what that expectant responsiveness might enable? For nothing will be impossible with God. A second characteristic of life shaped by grace is that it's merciful. Mercy is connected to kindness and compassion. It's about being slow to anger and slow to condemn. The merciful are those who are inclined to cut other people some slack, not jumping on every foible or clumsy word, every difference or fault, as if that licenses me to dismiss you forever. Mercy is about recognising others and ourselves as sharers in the same life. All of us, fragile fellow creatures, held in the love of God. The capacity to be merciful is an outworking of grace because it flows from a fundamental sense of being unthreatened. I've already tried to show how to encounter God's grace is to know myself loved, accepted, let be. Grace bestows the basic confidence that there's nothing I need to do or achieve to earn my place in the world, and that nothing can separate me from the love of God. With this fundamental confidence, I'm more able to let you be. I'm liberated from the tacit sense of rivalry or competition that so often poisons our relationships with each other, from that tacit need to compare or justify or assert myself in comparison with you, and so gain my identity at your expense. Theologically speaking, this is what it means to be justified by grace. Integrated, aligned, put right. As St. Paul put it, if God is for us, who can be against us? If I am called to be by God's free determination and not by my own efforts, then this is the ground of a new kind of human community, one that's free from rivalry and so capable of genuine hospitality, friendship, and care. I think what matters particularly about mercy in our context is not just that it makes us nicer to each other more of the time. It's also that a culture of mercy is a condition for deep listening and real dialogue. It's the condition of synodality. People can only open to another's experience. They can only be open to another interpretation of reality when they do not need above all else to defend themselves or to carve out a place for themselves in what they feel is a hostile environment. I can only change my mind or consider I may be mistaken in a context where I'm not going to be annihilated or ridiculed or humiliated for doing so. Pope Francis wrote of dialogue being possible when people are willing to learn from each other in a mutual exchange of gifts. This, he said, requires humility and trust. It requires also, I think, a generous or merciful listening. This capacity to bear with the pain of disagreement in that spirit of mercy. And the miracle is that when this kind of conversation is possible, when this kind of dialogue happens, it can break through seemingly intractable problems and differences. At such moments, Pope Francis wrote, the solution comes in ways that are unexpected and unforeseen, the result of a new and great creativity released, as it were, from the outside. And in this we see that grace is both a condition and a fruit of real dialogue and exchange. A condition and fruit of the synodal processes our world so desperately needs. And finally, a third dimension of a life shaped by grace is its truthfulness. The whole idea of grace can, as a friend of mine put it, seem a bit fuzzy. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer too was critical of the proclamation of what he called cheap grace. In a powerful poem, Sufferings, Irish poet-priest Michael McCarthy parodies the tendency of preachers to, as he puts it, talk sedately of love in a way that fails to touch the pain of the world. Bonhoeffer wrote, cheap grace means grace as a doctrine, a principle, a system. It means forgiveness of sins proclaimed as a general truth, the love of God taught as the Christian conception of God. But real grace doesn't come cheap. It's not some blanket proclamation of divine benevolence, not a bland legitimation of all we are and do. The grace of God calls us really to be reconciled, and this requires us really to face the truth of what is unreconciled in ourselves and in our world. A life shaped by grace doesn't bypass the fact of evil or the depth of our hurt, but seeks to participate in its transformation as Jesus did. Christ, who dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. What then does it mean to participate in the world's transformation by grace? For Jesus, it involved drawing near to the world's brokenness and suffering its violence without paying it back in kind. It involved being so sourced in the love of God, so confident in his own grace-filled being, that he could forgive those who betrayed and crucified him to keep open the possibility that their lives might be healed of cruelty, guilt, and shame. But as for those he forgave and called to new life, receiving this gift of grace required them to acknowledge the truth of what they had been and done. Think of Peter confronted by Jesus with his threefold denial, as Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. This isn't because Jesus requires a little grovelling before being willing to extend his grace. It's because unless Peter could be present to all that he had been and done, he could not truly be released from its burden. There would always remain some part of his identity, his history, left unreconciled, covered over perhaps by shame and self-loathing. Forgiving and being forgiven is mostly no easy matter, and much damage has been done by refusing to acknowledge this. Some who have been abused, for example, have been exhorted by the church to extend grace to their abusers, to let go their complaint, anger, and grief, without any acknowledgement of the injustice they've suffered, and in the absence of any truth-telling on the part of the abuser or the institutions that may have covered for them. This exhortation to cheap grace, says Bonhoeffer, means the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. Grace alone does everything, they say, and so everything can remain as it was before. This is a travesty. And we must also acknowledge that there are wounds so deep that sometimes the journey towards even the possibility of forgiveness takes a lifetime. Sometimes all we can do is seek to be on the way. And yet, the difficult proclamation of our tradition remains that the grace of God is offered to and for all. God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. And in a brilliant meditation on the book of Jonah, English theologian David Blower wrote, "The grace of God is awful to us, because the proper response to evil is to fear it and desire its destruction, not to love it and desire its redemption." But this is what it means to participate in the world's transformation by grace. Let me emphasise again, this is not about minimising the horror of evil or the suffering of injustice. The Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita has said that a saint's love for an evildoer is a severe love. This is because it does not count as love unless it's lucid about the evil of a person's crimes, about the banality of their response to them, and about their failures to be remorseful for them. But love it is. And it seems to me that it's this truthful and severe love, this truthful and severe grace, which Pope Leo has recently been offering the handful of tyrants who, he says, are ravaging our world. In various ways, the Pope has simultaneously confronted them with the truth of themselves and their actions, while still holding out the possibility of their transformation. It's as if he's saying, look at what you're doing. Be recalled to your humanity. Turn from this path of destruction. Enough of the idolatry of self and money. Enough of the display of power. Enough of war. True strength is shown in serving life. These sound like words of judgment. But as with Christ's denunciation of the corrupt powers of his day, this is judgment in the service of redemption. It's the truth which sets free, the grace of God which seeks out the lost and genuinely yearns for the repenting of falsity and violence, that all may turn and live. There is then another paradox about grace. On the one hand, the grace of God brings joy, freedom, peace. It draws us into a different quality of life, offers a different ground for being. It's what we yearn for, and it changes everything. And at the same time, to imagine a life shaped by grace, to live one, really does call for daring. To practice expectancy in a culture which is impatient and prizes the shortest route to predetermined outcomes. To practice mercy in a culture which encourages polarisation and the merciless vilification of enemies. To practice living from truth in a culture that has little capacity to bear reality. All this is, well, countercultural. There's so much pressure to shut down the space, to erase what doesn't fit or isn't convenient. Keeping faith with the gift and promise of grace, then, as leaders and teachers, as organisations and communities, really takes something. Calls for the willingness to be transformed oneself. It calls for courage and commitment. But the grace of God abounds and calls us constantly to realise a different way of being human. By grace, we're invited to grow to maturity, into the full stature of Christ, as St. Paul put it, so that in, through, and with him, we may participate in the healing of the whole. And so may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen. Going to invite you to take a moment just to be quiet and to just let yourself be with whatever you're present to at this moment. And in a moment we'll then move into a time of reflection and question. But let's just take a moment just to be still and quiet together.
Well, welcome back, everybody. And before we start our time for some question, can you please join me again in thanking Dr. Sarah Bachelard for it was really beautiful. There was so much richness in your lecture, and I know there's so many things that we'll ponder for a long time. But I want to get really practical for a start. Many of us here are parents, carers, educators. Our world is young people, and dealing with young people who are often distracting and distracted. Your lecture this year was calling us to a radical availability, a radical receptivity. For many of us who are dealing with young people day in, day out, what practical practices might you identify in young people that would help them to grow in receptivity and attentiveness?
It's a great question. I guess a few things come to mind. One is, I think, partly it's about having that modelled to them, and experiencing our availability and receptivity to them. So it's something about being present to another person in such a way that they can actually start to become more present to themselves. And I think, you know, that's a really important role for parents and for teachers and for anybody. I'm sorry, everyone, I seem to be making noises here, but so there's that. I know in the Catholic school system there's many schools that are introducing a practice of contemplation or meditation as part of the school life, and again I think that's an opportunity for young people to start to learn to inhabit with less anxiety that kind of space of stillness and silence, and discover their own inner life and their own, the possibility of listening more deeply. And then I think things like time in the natural world, art practice, music, all the things which actually enable people, that movement of unselfing or decentering, like the paying attention to something beyond the self, but which is not just a host of diversions, that line from that poem, but is actually something that's nourishing and sustaining and connecting to the real. Any of that, I think, is also part of cultivating that receptive capacity.
Good question, but better answer. It was really beautiful. Particularly the concept, I think, Iris Murdoch, wasn't it, of unselfing?
Unselfing, yeah. And there's a lovely essay that many of you may know by Simone Weil. She's got an essay called The Right Use of School Studies with a View to Prayer, or some kind of catchy title like that. But her idea is that actually paying attention to anything is part of what opens you to God, because you're paying attention beyond the self. So that school studies, like a student who's really attending to a maths problem or an English or, like I said, an art practice, is already discovering the kind of other-centred attention which is really the condition of prayer.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. We might open it up now to some of the questions from the floor. And Janina Starkey, thank you.
Thank you. So my name's Janina. I'm part of the Sydney Marist. Sarah, your original revelation and feeling of grace, it was very real and very human. And later you spoke to of Mary being presented as an icon of receptivity and grace. What do you think are the marks of a Mary-like receptivity for us in daily life, as opposed, like one that's real and not idealised, and one that we can take with us to our workplaces and embed in our Marist spirituality?
think there are lots of ways I could respond to that, but and maybe different people will have different experiences of this. My sense, and I guess part of what's interesting in the iconography of Mary is that she's often shown on her own, reading a book or in a garden. There's a sense in which she has some space in her life, some space in herself. And it's into that space that grace comes. And for me, that's the significance of the daily practice of meditation. It's not that I spend the whole day meditating, some defined periods, but then that does start, you do take that then into your ordinary life or into the school or into the workplace. Not because you're thinking about meditation, not because you're talking about it, but just somehow a little more interior space has been created, and then that kind of is present with you in the day. So I do think that some kind of practice like that is actually important. I think it's hard to... We can say grace is everywhere and at any moment and in all the ordinary things like the eating and drinking, and all of that's true, but we can also miss it all the time because we're actually not, we're not present to it. So I guess the question is, what are the ways, and it may be different for different people, but how do I practice presence? And, I guess that lovely book of Brother Lawrence's, in the kitchen duties or in whatever we're doing, how do we practice presence? Because I think that's the real key to it, yeah.
That's hit a chord with most people here and online. It's one of the characteristics of our spirituality, that whole sense of presence there. So you've picked that up beautifully, Sarah. Well done.
Excellent.
If we go online now and heading to Adelaide, a question from Adelaide. What gives you hope that grace-shaped leadership is possible in today's polarised world?
Well, I quoted from Pope Leo. I think that's an instance of it, of somebody who is shaped by grace, seeking to offer leadership, offer a different kind of voice in the midst of the polarisation. Of course, that doesn't mean all of a sudden everybody agrees with him. Of course not, So, but there's something about seeking to inhabit that space where I'm not just I'm on this side or on this side, but I'm somehow seeking to inhabit that space where something else could come forth. And I guess then the other hope of that is not looking at, major world leaders or things we all read about in the paper, but just what we encounter in daily life, in schools, in teachers who are seeking to hold open that space for their students to grow into, or other communities. Speaking to Paul today about, Vincent Long, the Bishop of Parramatta, like trying to hold open that kind of a space. So I think, and this is where I think the Marist charism of formation is so key, because if, as young people are introduced to the possibility of that kind of space, that kind of way of being, then you can't go into the world in quite the same glib either-or way as other parts of the culture might tend to form you. So I think the hope is that some of us remember the possibility of it and seek to live it out. Like, that's it. Like, it starts with all of us. It's not, it's not waiting for some external person to suddenly embody it, although it's lovely when they do.
You've said that twice now. You've picked up that whole piece about our witness essentially a modelling for young people, and modelling in our places of work, in our families.
Yeah, and it's not just modelling, it is that, but it's also then, you know, I guess learning certain skills about how to enable people who might be in a stuck situation to have a different kind of conversation, and I think that's where the learning the synodal way is important, or in inviting people into certain kinds of interactions or relationships which break through that tired, futile enmity. So it's not just modelling. It's modelling, but it's also the commitment to fostering practices, communal, organisational, educational practices that actually help to create those spaces.
Thanks. Yeah, great answer.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. I might just go to the room again. Just trying to see through the lights here, but Pat, who's it was Pat? Pat, there he is. Sorry.
Sarah, Pat O'Reilly, member of the association and work for Marist 180. Thank you for your words and thank you for the time and preparation that you've invested in bringing all of that to us tonight. I was quite taken by your paths or routes, the concepts of crisis and contemplation, and thinking about those in their own rights, but taking it a step further and interested in points of intersection, points of overlap, points where the two paths may meet.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it would have been a good thing if I'd said this, but I think there's a very strong, I mean, often it's a practice of contemplation that might lead you into crisis because it might lead you to a point where you're no longer able to go along with a certain way of doing things, or, you know. And similarly, it's a time of crisis that often pitches people into that contemplative space or leads them to seek to inhabit that. So they're definitely, you know, one leads to the other. And I guess I would also say, if you have a practice of contemplation, when you are pitched into crisis, the crisis is still maybe horrible and destabilising and difficult, but it gives you a way to hang in there, you know, in a way that if you don't have that, you've got to then painfully discover that as part of the whole process. So, yeah, I think there's a real interweaving, and I certainly feel like that in my own life. It was times of crisis that first brought me to meditation, but then meditation itself led me into an even bigger crisis. I was like, thanks very much for that, oh Lord. So, yeah, there's definitely that interweaving, yeah.
Sarah, we might go to another online question from Brisbane. Bearing in mind the importance of learning to wait expectantly, what are some of the ways you've learned to unself and adopt radical availability?
Well, I shared a couple of stories from my experience of times where I felt like I got to the end of my own resources, and in one case I think I fairly quickly went back to old habits and strategies and expectations, you know, so that didn't last that long. Then the next time it was like really getting to really realising the futility of some of those old strategies and expectations, and then just knowing at that kind of gut level that actually this there's no point, this is futile, I can't go back to this. But the waiting is really tough, and there's months of just trying not to panic that the whole thing was, you know, the whole thing was passing me by or unravelling. And I do remember saying to God a couple of times, like, you do remember I'm mortal, like this waiting can only go on so long. So, you know, so I think it is partly about, there's something about realising, not just having the idea, but really knowing that other way is fruitless. Like I can't keep going that way. I have no idea what the other way is. I don't know how to do that. But I can't go back to that other way, even though well, like I said, there were times when I felt like panicking, but it's kind of like, no, let me just come back, let me come back. And again, that's where the practice, I guess, really helps to ground you there. I mean, that's a particular story. There'll be other versions of that people have. I think fundamentally for me, it was the image of listening, waiting and listening. Like, I'm listening beyond myself. I'm listening for something to come towards me, and I'm willing to take the risk of not just filling in the space with the first thing that looks likely. I've kind of got to hold my nerve and hold the space. And that seems to be necessary. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Just back to the room again. There was a hand up just over here. Sorry, your name?
Hi,
Virginia.
it's Virginia Fortunate from Parramatta Catholic Schools. Thank you, Sarah. I wondered whether you spoke beautifully around opening that space, but I'm curious to know about how you were accompanied in that journey. I'm hearing you had a lot of great self-talk from even just now, and how you're talking to God, but you're also doing your own self-talk. But I'm wondering what your experience was like being accompanied from times of crisis. A lot of us are working in schools with students, as I said, but also with leaders and staff. Have you got any tips, I guess, in terms of your experience of being accompanied in that journey, or how I guess could you flip that? Could you tell us about how your experience of being accompanied yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I have to say, a fair bit of that time I wasn't particularly accompanied. So I had friends, but I wasn't, I wasn't particularly connected with a religious community. I didn't have a spiritual director at the time, and so, and I was in a context where people think I'm mad if they think I'm going back to church. So, so there was a bit of it that was a bit solitary. It hasn't always been like that, of course, and there have been other crises where people like a spiritual director or, other people have been really important as a way of, being held and connected. And I guess in terms of accompanying others who may be going through that space, I feel like, again, I think that felt sense of your own connectedness to that possibility of grace, that, and your own experience of that is really significant, because it gives, or in my experience anyway, it's sort of given me the confidence to be with people, and even when they're not feeling it, it's there. It's so there's a kind of a trust that there is another other, as James Allison puts it, who and to trust people's own journeys to that, knowing that it has to sometimes go through an unravelling or through an unmaking. And of course there are times when that's I mean, I don't want to be glib about that, because there are versions of that journey which are overwhelming for people and are dangerous, and and so that then takes a whole range of skills and awarenesses, especially for young people too. So I'm not just kind of glibly saying, oh well, you're having a dark night of the soul, carry on. It's not like that, and at the same time, I think to have some sense of what the pattern of this deeper journey is, and to have known that for yourself, enables you to help people be with it without panicking. Again, like it's that kind of awareness that this is a necessary path at times, and there is a way through, even though none of us actually can advise what that is or what you should, but to kind of collectively hold our nerve with that, I think is really, really important. My own work hasn't been with adolescents, and so I'm, like I said, I don't want to be glib about what that's like in that context. But I think part of it, even there, might be to have one's own confidence that there is grace at work here and available. Yeah.
Thanks, Virginia. Just our final question from the audience and online is from the other side of the country, Western Australia. How might we help young people begin to encounter this movement away from self-preoccupation?
I guess maybe part of it is also discerning the roots of the self-preoccupation, because I think often it's because of hurting or being wounded or not being properly attended to. It's a bit like you've got a toothache and then someone tells you, well, forget about your toothache, look at the beauty of the daisies or whatever. All you can think about is your toothache. And if there's an inner hurt or lack or neglect or being unattended to, of course, the healthy ego is actually going to try and redress that. And so the self-preoccupation is actually seeking healing of some kind. And so if that's what's going on, then maybe part of it is actually proper attention and a proper, loving of a person, so that gradually they're not the only ones having to look after themselves, if you like. So maybe that would be part of it. I guess when I responded to your question, John, I was, talking a little bit about that too. Like if it's partly just about a culture which encourages a kind of a preoccupation with image or preoccupation with success or all those things that are so pernicious, perhaps enabling things like a gentle, simple contemplative practice or time in the bush or time with elders or time with, in spaces where people get a glimpse of a larger reality, a larger world that is interesting and might draw them. So I guess, maybe it's different depending on some of what you sense is going on in the self-preoccupation.
Great.
Yeah.
Final question from me. I want to take you, given it's the Marian Lecture, take you back to Mary. For an Anglican, you spoke beautifully about Mary, and it's not a criticism, but it's an interesting observation. You spoke about Mary, whose life you described as a constant turning and returning, an endless growth of love. You spoke about yourself beautifully, of that morning when you woke up and you heard those words in your heart, let it be with me according to your word. And in your book, which I've read, it was a beautiful book, Pools of Grace, you suggest that Mary is not a passive vessel, but an actively engaged woman, inquiring, pondering, consenting. And as John May suggests, who you again reference, she was a woman with a rich, healthy and creative interiority. So for us, for Sarah Bachelard, who is Mary for you? And for us, how might Mary's spirit shape our lives gracefully?
Well, I think you said in a way who Mary is for me. On the one hand, she is that radical listening, that availability, that receptivity. But she's engaged with what she's receiving, and you quoted. I guess I'm really struck. Like 3 times in the Gospel of Luke, Mary is said to ponder these things in her heart. Like when the Gabriel visits, when Jesus is lost in the temple when he's 12 years old, and one other time I forget. But each time Mary didn't understand what was said, and she pondered these things in her heart. So what that suggests to me is that she's making meaning of what's happening to her. She's not just kind of like letting it be done unto her and as if she's not there. She's making meaning. She's engaged with her experience. She's growing with it. And I think, so in that sense, that there's that healthy interiority, that healthy reflective capacity, an inner life, which then informs how she lives her outer life. And so I guess a Marian spirituality, we do tend to emphasise the listening and the receptivity and the availability, but it's like, it's a bit of a cliche, but I guess that sense in which God doesn't just act on us without us. There's this kind of invitation to be part of it, to cooperate, to bring to fullness that which is being offered. And I think that's a model for any spiritual life.
Great answer. Beautiful answer. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We met in Canberra last week with all the golden and red trees, and after we met, I drove out of Canberra thinking I'd met a person who was full of grace, and I think that's flowed through the time you've spent with us tonight and your beautiful presentation. You've encouraged us, I think, in your presentation to be more attentive, to take care with that, to ask the deeper questions, and to seek God in our own small and faithful ways. So thank you for your gracious presence among us, and for the quiet authority of your words, which invite us, I don't think to certainty, but invite us to openness, receptivity and hope. And we're very, very grateful for that. So on behalf of the Marist Association and Marist Schools Australia, and on behalf of everybody who's here tonight and online, our sincere gratitude. As a gesture of our appreciation, we'd like to offer you a special gift, which, if all the technology works, will be on the screen behind me. It's an icon of the province for our province, called Mary's Star of the Sea. And Brother Peter Carroll, our Superior General, speaks about its beauty is gentle, asking only for stillness. So tonight, thank you for delivering this year's Marian Lecture, and to each of you for gathering with us in Australia, Oceania and beyond, for making this evening such a really rich and enjoyable presentation and a rich conversation. And thank you for your ongoing support of Marist Life, Marist Association and this year's lecture. Could you please join me in thanking most warmly Dr. Sarah Bachelard. Thanks, Sarah. And I'd invite you here in the room and online to our final prayer in honour of Mary, our good mother, the Salve Regina.